Hello, folks. How y'all doing today? Pleasure to join you. Happy today to talk about warning. Very quick obligatory caveats. Everything I say today will be entirely unclassified. I'm speaking as an academic from an apolitical and vendor-neutral perspective. And these views and opinions are expressed are only my own and not reflective of any part of the US government. In terms of who am I to be talking to you about the question of warning, I'm a former intelligence practitioner that's become an academic along the way. And I was an industry CTI practitioner. I was the first intelligence hire and the chief intelligence analyst at IOCs Partners. I went on to become a think tank type. My research primarily focuses on the questions of decision advantage in cyber intelligence. And I work extensively across a variety of questions of offensive and counter cyber interactions. I've also spent a good deal of time working with the Office of Director of National Intelligence to explore warning tradecraft as part of a tradecraft uplift for intelligence education. So happy to talk through some of the matters we serviced there and talk through its application in a variety of the shops we've been in. Why do we call warning the first purpose of intelligence, or the core mission, if you want to use CIA's terminology? Well, it comes from where the intelligence community as a whole came to be. We started out of an intelligence failure. Everyone is very well aware of the story of Pearl Harbor. I won't get into it, but at the end of the day, it was a highly technical specialty and discipline that was staring at little bumps and squiggles on a scope that had to interpret that last mile question of adversary capability and intention. The failure to do so led to creation of the intelligence community as we now understand it, intelligence as a professional activity. And the father of modern intelligence, Sherman Kent, speaks of intelligence as activities, intelligence as product, and intelligence as organization. We tend to be really focused on organizational logos. We want to know where they came from. We want to know who wore what logo. And ultimately, it's more important here to focus on the activity itself. The failure of warning at Pearl Harbor also led to the first of the intelligence after action reviews that were ever conducted. A very smart lady by the name of Roberta Wohlstetter wrote a book called Warning and Decision, in which she unpacked a variety of the pathologies and a variety of the issues that led to the lack of cohesion across the community. She was the first to identify the problem with signals versus noise, the idea that we are overwhelmed with the volume, velocity, and variety of information that means we cannot, as humans, process all of these independent threads absent formal structures and processes to do so. She was the first to identify that consumers could not be their own analysts. They could not be given raw information and be expected to make sense of these things. A lot of these principles became baked into our work over the decades. But at the end of the day, we are more than just the federal intelligence community. Right? We typically represent the national intelligence community as a wheel of agencies in some sort of structural relationship. A lot of it talks in the intelligence world revolve around reorganizing and restructuring these entities. That's not terribly helpful for those of us in the cyber intelligence community practice. Right? We are all intelligence professionals. We all do intelligence as an activity, but we don't all come from that core center wheel. And certainly we don't all come as prior intelligence professionals. There's a lot of folks that enter this environment from very different skills communities: engineers, software developers, reverse malware analysts, a whole series of folks that simply did not have that prior experience. But we're all doing this work. And ultimately, we all came to do this work, and we've all had several very hard years. Many of our shops were established also at major failure points, either because of the breach of an organization or the breach of an organization much like ourselves, which convinced the decision maker of the need to invest in an intelligence capacity and capability. And when I talk about warning failures in this presentation, I'm not here to point fingers. I was part of a variety of these major cases we're going to be discussing. I personally exhibited many of the pathologies I'm going to call out here. I'm not going to name names of other folks in the shop. If I'm pointing something out, you can assume it was my failure. My failures were, however, reflected also more broadly across the community. And I'm going to be talking only about the industry side of this at the moment, because that's predominantly who's here and why we're here to talk today. My colleague Richard Betts up at Columbia identifies the enemies of intelligence, a series of issues that lead to what are essentially what he calls the inevitability of surprise in the space. Unfortunately, we'll talk a little bit about who opposes that viewpoint. I really respect the gentleman. He has some incredible ways of thinking, and he identifies failures of perspective. That is, we don't see what we need to see. We don't understand what we are seeing. He talks about the pathologies of communication, even if we understand what we are seeing properly, and therefore we fail to appropriately convey that. He also talks about the paradoxes of perception, the idea that even though we see something, what we see may actually be changing, and what the act of our observation may change the influence, may change or influence those behaviors in a way that the adversary changes. Ultimately, all of these enemies of intelligence play out differently between attack warning and other operational evaluation tasks. They also further change when you're looking at forward defense planning tasks. So there's a serious difference between what is happening in an imminent event and what you're doing for longer term countermeasures investments, even though you may be trying to issue warning across the same cycle of adversary activity. Ultimately, my colleague Jason Healy has taken a lot of this work and broken down the mechanisms of surprise. That is, the adversary may do something through different operational means than we were expecting. They may have different technical means than we were expecting. They may change their timing, change the scale, change trends in their operations in ways that surprise us. And ultimately, they may address a different target than we were expecting, potentially for a different objective. This leads to a variety of different types of surprise. The most common, of course, being Pearl Harbor, the bolt from the blue attack, where we were at peace, we were at a state of calm, and the adversary took an action we were not expecting. When my friend Lynn Chorto stood up in front of Congress in 1991 and talked about an electronic Pearl Harbor, the idea of a cyber bolt from the blue, that was a pretty novel concept. The utility of that analytic construct may be debated this many decades into the cyber environment. But we should not discount the possibility of bolt from the blue attacks in different crisis moments. We also have problems with technology innovation. That is the classic Sputnik moment, where the adversary does something using a technology stack we did not think they possessed, to a degree of sophistication we did not understand that they had. We can also talk about capabilities innovation, where an adversary uses a series of known technologies and puts them together in a novel way to achieve something we didn't think that they could achieve. In this case, Ababil, the Iranian large-scale distributed denial of service attacks against the US and global financial sector, is a great example. We can also talk about the idea of conception breaks, or as one analyst calls it, the OODA shear, the observe, orient, decide, act, loop shear. The conception was the idea of a general estimated consensus that takes hold within a given crisis moment. When the adversary's actions are outside of that consensus estimate, you have a conception break. And of course, the most recent of these examples is the retreat from Afghanistan. I call out kinetic examples here because they're easy to grasp these principles in very quick moments. We'll talk about them in cyber much more. I'll give you a series of caveats, however, to the idea that surprise is inevitable, because the great CIA analytic tradecraft expert, Jack Davis, was very much opposed to this idea. Because if surprise is inevitable, there is no role for intelligence. We simply fail. And none of us can accept this. And it's not just a matter that we are intelligence professionals, that we call ourselves intelligence professionals. We must do the work, even if the work only gets us so far. You know, in one ways we can say we're taking up arms against the sea of troubles, and by our actions, making that difference. And that's a strong motivation to come in every day to keep in that fight. We're also going to talk a little bit about the problem that warning is not always a specific dedicated function in an intelligence shop. In some organizations in the national environment, that was true for a period of time. The J2 within the military intelligence organization has a specific warning function. There was, for a time, a national intelligence officer for warning. But we have shifted over time to think about warning as an obligation on every intelligence element. So every analyst is a warning analyst. But of course, as we know from The Incredibles, if everyone is special, no one is. If you assume warning is being done somewhere in your organization, and you're not therefore on the hook to do it, does that warning actually get done properly? So in this case, I like to think of warning analysts as a forlorn hope. You may be that individual that is the first to drive into the breach, the first to charge into the guns when there's a crisis or when there's a moment. It may mean you're the one that takes the most fire organizationally among your peers, but it still is a job that needs to be done. Among the folks that have done that job exceptionally well over the years is the great lady of warning, Ms. Cynthia Gravo. I truly wish we had a better picture of Cynthia. I have been impressing greatly upon the Defense Intelligence Agency the need for an official portrait that is more flattering, but unfortunately, this is what we have at the moment. When we talk about the great lady of warning, she wrote one of the better texts in the 1970s. Unfortunately, it was buried for a number of decades until my friend Jan Herring worked very hard to get this declassified. But one of the most important things that Cynthia had to tell us is that warning is an intangible. This theory, a belief, it's a hypothesis, and hypotheses, obviously, of intelligence folks tend to be very important. Its validity cannot be confirmed or refuted until it is too late. Intelligence is not about writing what happened already. It's about what is to come. If journalism is the first draft of history, then intelligence is the first draft of journalism. And as a result, you may be wrong. And it's important to have that forward-looking perspective in our work. There are very subtle distinctions of language when we're talking about the classic indications and warning tradecraft, classic warning tradecraft. Indicators are these abstracted but discrete elements of a modeled course of action by which an adversary manifests threat capabilities and intentions against its target and its attack surfaces and exposures. These are the things we can, in theory, say an adversary must do as part of process preparation and execution to achieve surprise or to achieve actions on objective or actions against objectives. The indication are the concrete observables we have identified through collection that represents evidence that that abstract indicator is actually happening now or happening within the horizon of warning. We've abused this language immensely over the years because we all talk about these IOCs, indicators of compromise. Well, IOCs are both prior evidence collected that something has happened, that is, an adversary's use of an infrastructure, an adversary's tooling artifacts, some other observable within a networked environment. But it's also the abstracted idea that if you see something like this in your environment, you have a concrete problem at the current point. That's a very narrow and tactical and technical view of indications. So we have to think very hard when we use this language. And we tend to abuse it and think we're doing things we're not when we're doing warning. So instead, let's talk about what makes for a good indicator, these abstract ideas that we're thinking about. Well, first of all, it's got to be detectable. If you don't have a collection system that can observe adversary activity of this nature, you're not going to be able to think about the adversary's behavior. It's got to be diagnostic. Ideally, it should be indicative of only a single process towards an adversary's hostile course of action, and only capable of being executed by that adversary. Unfortunately, in the real world, a lot of folks can take similar actions that may have different outcomes. They may have actions that other third parties in the environment can imitate as deception measures. So not indicators will be as diagnostic as we would like. They must be reliable, however. They must be something that we can routinely believe is a common set of actions or thing that the adversary has been doing and will continue to do. It's no good to have indicators that the adversary abandoned decades ago or months ago in an intrusion. And of course, they must be early. I'll throw in a very quick plug for the text Target-Centric Intelligence. This is when you're working with indicators, understanding an adversary's processes, understanding their doctrine, their organization, their training material, leadership, education, personnel, facilities, policy, all these abstracts and intangibles that lead to different behaviors against which you can collect are all incredibly important to developing your indicators for a given crisis. So we also talk about we'll talk a little bit about, instead of the theory of this, how we move to warning and line intelligence assignments. Right? Warning doesn't just emerge from the simple compilation of facts. Right? We talk often about the idea that hashes or didn't happen. Well, unfortunately, when we're talking about future adversary courses of action and behaviors, those things have not yet happened. Therefore, you won't have a hash. You won't necessarily have a log entry that will describe the adversary's behavior to come. By the time you see that log entry, it's generally too late. It's not merely current intelligence. I won't dive too much into the tyranny of current intelligence because my colleague, Sherman Chu, will be doing an entire talk on this afternoon. But it's very important to understand that the more we are working on describing and explaining behaviors that are happening now, the greater our challenges of estimating future outcomes become. We get sucked into the now, we get sucked into what we know. It also requires that inferences be drawn. You've got to go beyond what you've seen already, and you've got to create this hypothesis, defend this hypothesis. It's not just a matter of fortune telling, right? We're not issued a crystal ball that we can magically understand where the adversary comes from and what they'll be doing next. And contrary to some of the talks in previous years at SANS, unfortunately, good warning requires a degree of attribution. You have to understand who this adversary is, how their organizations work, what their behaviors are, how they think about problems, to understand what those courses of action are. You're not going to know what is in their minds, but intelligence is built on behavioral observations, and you're going to need to understand those behaviors. Ultimately, however, in any time you're targeting another hostile foreign intelligence service, a hostile military service, a mercenary contractor, there are going to be limits to the collection capabilities that you have. You've got to therefore be incredibly mindful of those limits and be able to identify the gaps and account for adversary denial and deception in those gaps. We'll throw a quick series of case studies out for you to make this a little more practical in a way that you can understand. Sorry, I lost the slide click there. The first case study, of course, is the 2017 Wannacry incident. This is a difficult case. We all faced this issue. We all went through this crisis. Ultimately, the adversary started a series of shifts towards financial theft to support a variety of proliferation and regime objectives that weren't fully recognized within the cyber threat intelligence community as the adversary was developing up their teams. They began in February of 2017 to test a series of ransomware variants that they would later exploit for a variety of future operations. Those ransomware variants were understood, and very specific warning was, or reporting was issued within different industry shops by April of 2017. And unfortunately, those samples weren't really looked at, right? There was, we talk about the signal versus noise. We talk about the inadequate examination of evidence in this case. There was code overlap and reuse from these samples into the payload that eventually became Wannacry. We talk a little bit about the pathology of inadequate understanding of precedent as a warning problem. Well, the adversary in this case had been doing a lot of work on lateral movement through SMB exploitation. So of course, when Eternal Blue was leaked from an alleged government holding in April of 2017, it was quite natural that the adversary would pick up on a better way to conduct SMB exploitation and incorporate this very quickly into its operations. Unfortunately, we also have a problem here of the misjudgment of timing. When the adversary executed its fires on 12 May of 2017, we have a challenge of understanding whether or not that was intentional at the point in time that they pulled that trigger. I argue actually that this was a misfire. The adversary did not mean to release that code worldwide at the manner and the time that it did. It's very hard to issue warning about an adversary's own mistakes. It's a very difficult product to write because you can talk about an adversary's intent to develop a capability. You can talk about how they might use that capability. You can talk about where they're going with the overall objectives of having that capability. But when they fail and create a worldwide incident, well, that's a very difficult warning moment. There are some things that could have been written ahead of time. Folks were not writing specifically, and I'm not aware of anyone that did. I certainly did not myself write a product talking about the incorporation of the new exploits within existing programs in the way that we saw them emerge during those hard months of 2017. And ultimately, it comes down to a reluctance to believe. The April 2017 reporting regarding this campaign and its ongoing testing since December of 2016 was received with substantial skepticism when it was discussed among some of the industry professionals that I know. There was an unwillingness to accept the crossover between criminal malware and state-sponsored intrusion activities for this actor. Now, we can talk about this. This has been a debate we've had for nigh on 15 years across Russian actors, across Iranian actors. Every time it comes up, it's a debate. But it's something we have to think about. The second case I'll walk through very quickly is the issue of Spectre and Meltdown and other side channel execution. In 2017, a series of academic researchers developed novel side channel exploitation techniques, speculative exploitation techniques, that worked against basically every processor introduced since about 1998. This was an incredible bit of work, and it had widespread implications throughout the industry. I won't go too much into the vulnerabilities themselves. We have literally dozens of talks talking about the related sets of issues involved, but it's important to know that industry was given early access through coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and a lot of the key stakeholders that were important in this process did not actually know about this. Unfortunately, in the 6 months between when this became an issue for industry and when the embargo broke in January of 2018 and it became public that these vulnerabilities could be exploited in the manner that they could be exploited, that wasn't widely understood by some folks that really needed to know about this. For example, the White House, a senior White House official, indicated that they had no advanced knowledge of this. And I believe the gentleman, he's a man of honor, and when he says this, I believe what he had to say. But unfortunately, we have industry reporting that the Chinese Ministry of State Security, for example, had early access and awareness of this vulnerability. By the end of January 2018, there were commercially available exploit options for these vulnerabilities that were incorporated into certain high-performance tooling sets. It's highly likely that sometime in mid-2017 that the adversary had similar capabilities. We kick off from that point in time a series of related exploitation research lines, which resulted in some incredibly staggering and staggeringly useful vulnerabilities, all circling around this idea of weird machine states that Halvar Flake talks about. I won't go too much into those additional vulnerabilities, but each one of those had a period of early observation, largely coming out of the academic environment. And we have a series of adversaries that sought to incorporate these capabilities very quickly into their arsenals. And I still do not believe we have an adequate understanding of how that progression has occurred throughout a variety of programs. It's a very high-end capability. It's your classic technology surprise, particularly when it comes down to sets of targets where we have to rip out the hardware involved in order to get effective mitigation. The reason why I am so firmly of the opinion that this is a problem is in 2021, we have a set of Chinese strategic support force authors that are openly writing about capabilities from microarchitectural update subversion and other associated exploitation in their own internal journals. And to make matters worse, we have a sanctioned Russian contractor allegedly working for their foreign intelligence services, whose staff are openly mocking the PLA SSF for not being anywhere near as advanced in their understanding of this problem, their ability to leverage these capabilities in offensive purposes, as this contractor's own internal research. That's a moment where you might think it's an indication that we've been caught a bit flat-footed here, that there is a very large surprise on the horizon that might be something we care about. The third case I will throw out is a little bit different in that we have, okay, it's a surprise that hit all of us. It's something we had variable partial visibility on, but it's also the first time I want to talk about a corrective to how we break away, how we fix conception breaks or fix OODA shears. Of course, we all understand the attractiveness of supply chain operations to enable future intelligence targeting. We've seen a variety of these over the years, whether it was Dragonfly delivering Havocs implants back in the mid part of the past decade, whether it was a series of operations by various Chinese actors, including things like Shadowpad or CC Cleaner. Ultimately, though, when we look at Russian operators during this key period of time, we understand that they faced a substantial setback. And there were, according to public open source reporting, widespread compromises of the adversary's capabilities, particularly related to APT29 Cozy Bear, in which early warning was being provided, early access and understanding of those capabilities was being described. It meant the adversary was going to change. And I think all the folks that have been to this conference year over year remember the debates we had when certain of the well-understood sets of adversary tooling disappeared. And when the adversary began to change this behavior, we kept talking about where did they go? How do we think about what that change meant? But we have this conception that they were going to come back using sets of malware and sets of capabilities in the manner we'd previously seen. There was a common rotational cycle to their operations. There was a common, almost budgetary programmatic pipeline for new tooling and capabilities implants. And we've had other presentations over the years that have talked about what those pipelines meant. The general conception was that it simply was another step in that pipeline. But here we have a capabilities innovation moment where the adversary is able to put together some things that they already had in new ways and do something in an entirely different mission operation outside of our existing conception of what they would do. Now, I missed this as much as anyone, but I do something myself in my work, particularly that might be useful to you all, which is the concept of analytic divergence. To take random material, throw it against the wall, and try to think about what that would mean for the adversaries you care about. I happen to love this magical realism bot. It throws out, basically, it's a Markov predictive engine that throws out some randomness. And it helps me think about problems that I'm already chewing on somewhere in the back of my head that are bothering me in a way I can't necessarily consciously articulate, but allows me to call out something differently than I would otherwise. Unfortunately, a tweet is not a warning intelligence product. So yes, while I wrote this particular tweet, within roughly 60 days of the adversary beginning and concluding their testing, and within 30 days of the delivery of the capability that would be Holiday Bear, SolarWinds, Nobelium, this never went further. And ultimately, I also called it wrong because I was thinking about the California startup life. So I go, well, Silicon Valley's dead. Austin is the new Silicon Valley in one way of thinking. And of course, targeting SolarWinds in Austin was much more effective to the adversary than targeting a variety of folks in our usual haunts out in San Jose. Ultimately, I can talk through these case studies, but how do we come down to action on warning, right? Actionability is quite important, but it's only one of the axes of intelligence value. Right? We can talk about timeliness, we can talk about relevance, coherence, completeness, all of these other factors. Right? Ultimately, this requires more than the intelligence product itself. It requires operations engagement. How would you make those cases actionable? Well, in the first case, a lot of folks had to react to a new threat actor. They had to identify external exposures. They had to mitigate lateral movement options in ways they weren't used to. They should already have been doing so based on the vulnerability exposure, but vulnerability is only one axis. Vulnerability plus specific threat adoption against one's interest drives a different level of prioritization. And a number of organizations would have done so differently. In case study 2, we can talk about how we review IT acquisitions planning. How do you accelerate replacement cycles for older hardware? How do you explore novel detection of capabilities in your environment? In case study 3, we can talk about the evaluating controlled detonation of updates, including the deliberate GOAT operations, as we've talked about in multiple years. Of course, how do you review detection coverage for things that were potentially useful to the adversary in those environments? When we think overall about the entire problem of warning, I want to leave you with a few takeaways. How do you evaluate incremental change in your adversaries? This is often more challenging than assessing disruptive discontinuities. How do you focus on specific problems rather than thinking about all the threats globally? How do you state a warning problem relevant to your organization and your enterprise? Ultimately, how do you break out beyond naive predictions? That is, the idea that tomorrow will be like today, the threat will always increase. Now, this is less useful than asking why or what next in the adversary's capability. And ultimately, you must understand that warning is not a product of consensus. If Twitter SOC is all agreeing with you, someone is probably wrong, right? And you've got to be willing to take a stand. You've got to be willing to write that product that challenges that consensus, that breaks away from the conception. And ultimately, the products that you do not write are the ones that will haunt you the most. I talk about this from a place of personal sorrow because I should have written some products here. Warning is a process. It's not a single act. There is no warning if the warning is not read, is read but not believed, or believed but not really taken aboard and acted upon. Right? The consumer must hear, believe, and act for warning to occur. And ultimately, we must remember warning is the first purpose of intelligence, but it's not the singular purpose. Intelligence is asked to do more than one thing in support of decision makers. Warning must be a priority, but it is not the only anticipatory intelligence need. It's all a spectrum. It all demands balance. I will leave you with the image of the tightrope walker, which is on the Columbia campus, set up in memorial of Wild Bill Donovan, the founder of the Office of Strategic Services in World War II. Because it's the best analogy I can give you to the problem we face conducting warning, balancing warning across all the other things we're being asked to do. But those are all things we can talk about later. I'll leave you with a few resources, different books. These are in the slide deck that will be out this week. And I stand by for your questions and comments. Thank you very much.